The Museum of the World Ocean in Kaliningrad has many amazing exhibits, but the most impressive is Submarine B413. The submarines of her class became a symbol of the Cold War, just like the American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft or Soviet missiles on Cuba. And what's really interesting is they all have common history.
The Navy needed the submarines of this project to head out to the ocean and oppose our potential adversaries at that time, including many countries that are our partners today. And the submarines accomplished their mission.
In the mid-1950s, the backbone of the Soviet submarine fleet consisted of S-class boats. They were medium-sized submarines, mostly intended for operations in the border-straddling seas. However, by the end of the 1950s, the Soviet Navy started receiving the larger Foxtrot-class submarines. Thanks to modern engineering solutions and the materials used, these submarines had greater endurance, operational range, and submergence depth, as well as improved armament and living conditions for the crew. These ships were created to conduct strategic missions, such as disrupting oceanic communications from the potential adversary, which is why the submarines of this class were built in large quantities. The project turned out to be highly effective, and sailors greatly appreciated it from the very start.
They were top secret, and no one was allowed inside. Security was rigorous. They only let us, navigators, to go down and see the chart room. Of course, we were impressed beyond words. In the S-class, we sat and drew our maps on a little table adjacent to the staircase under a hatch where we were being drenched all the time. And our maps also got drenched. An electric box was right behind you and it could short-circuit on you. In the new sub, we had a separated cabin with a sofa, an auto-plotter, and navigation equipment for the radio compass. Of course, all of this made a huge impression on us.
Specifications of the B413 submarine. Length 91.3 meters. Beam 7.5 meters. Mean draft a little more than 5 meters. Displacement submerged 2,475 tons. She is a twin-hull submarine. The pressure hull thickness varies from 22 to 35 millimeters. Armament: 6 bow and 4 aft 533mm torpedo launchers. Ammunition: 22 torpedoes. Main propulsion plant: 3 twin-stroke diesel engines of 2,000 horsepower each. 2 underwater propulsion electric engines of 1,350 horsepower each. For the side shafts, 1 underwater propulsion electric engine of 2,700 horsepower for the central shaft. 1 underwater propulsion cruise electric engine of 140 horsepower for the central shaft. 4 groups of accumulator batteries, 112 elements each. Surface speed 17 knots, submerged speed 16 knots. Operational depth 250 meters, maximum depth 280 meters. Cruising range 30,000 miles at 8 knots, surfaced, 400 miles at 2 knots, submerged. Endurance 90 days. Crew 72 people.
Of course, the ship was much better suited to long cruises. Everyone had their individual place to rest. Not only did the captain have his own cabin, but officers did as well. It was nice to serve with such a level of comfort, although we didn't know the conditions in which we would serve.
Foxtrot-class submarines mostly served in the Northern Fleet. Boats sailed out on combat patrols from their bases near Murmansk. They operated in the Northern Atlantic and other more remote areas.
These submarines served in almost all the seas and oceans. However, they were specifically built for the middle latitudes. Conditions were especially hard during cruises to the southern latitudes.
On October 1, 1962, 4 submarines from the 69th Submarine Brigade of the Northern Fleet left their base at Gadriva. Of course, the crew wasn't surprised by the highest level of secrecy because the submarine service was secret by definition. However, while submariners were usually able to guess their approximate itinerary and mission when preparing for a cruise, this time was different.
And we had no idea where we were heading. Even out at sea, it was only when we sailed past Britain that we found out that we were heading to Cuba.
In the southern latitudes, the temperature rose to 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, especially in the 5th and 6th compartments, the electric and diesel engines. It was so bad that some of the crew fainted due to heat stroke.
The first compartment where torpedoes were stored was the coldest, 37 degrees Celsius. Any crew members who weren't on duty were allowed to go there to have a rest. They slept on torpedoes, in the hold, basically everywhere.
It's the forward torpedo room. Today, there's a gangway here for the sake of visitors, but it wasn't here at that time, and torpedoes were loaded into the room through that hatch. It happened like this. A torpedo is 8 meters long. It wouldn't fit into the compartment. That's why the submarine's interior design incorporated a special hatch, into which the torpedo's forward part was led during loading. When the tail was already in the compartment, the torpedo was hoisted up on special pulley blocks, rotated, and either stored on a rack or loaded directly into a torpedo tube.
In the standard strike configuration, torpedo tubes 3, 4, 5 and 6 were loaded with the type of torpedoes used against surface ships and anti-submarine ships. The 5365K torpedo was our main weapon. Our operating principle was based on the vertical location of the target ship's wake. A torpedo passing through a ship's wake would detect it, turn towards the target, follow its wake, and home in on the ship's propeller rudder system. The first and second torpedo tubes, located at the bottom, were loaded with Set 65 anti-submarine torpedoes. They were intended for self-defense or, depending on the mission, for destroying enemy submarines.
But we unloaded one of those torpedoes, and we were ordered to load another one at night. We had absolutely no idea that this was a nuclear torpedo.
In October 1962, 4 submarines of the Northern Fleet, armed with nuclear torpedoes in their launchers, sailed off to Cuba, maintaining complete radio silence. Another circumstance indicating that this was a combat mission was the order to get to Cuba quickly and secretly, and this was virtually impossible, because in order to arrive at the designated area in time, they needed to sail at a constant speed of 12 to 15 knots. Which the Foxtrot-class diesel submarines were able to maintain only when on the surface. If they had done this, they would have been discovered when entering the Atlantic, but making the voyage in a submerged state would have taken too long to meet the deadline set by command.
The submarine was not so much an underwater ship, but more of a diving one, so everything was limited. The time we could spend underwater was limited by the capacity of the accumulator batteries. It was between 3 to 4 days. However, when on a combat mission, it was necessary to reserve 1/3 of the capacity in case of unforeseen circumstances, such as encountering an enemy, etc. While a submarine is underwater, rubbish and waste pile up, and it all needs to be ejected to free up compartments, purge CO2 and hydrogen. When an accumulator battery charges, it actively produces hydrogen, which creates the danger of a fire or explosion. So we needed to surface every third day to recharge our batteries. Again, we didn't have the ability to define our location underwater. The orientation of the submarines of this project in particular, while underwater, was carried out by dead reckoning. The navigation plotting was done by dead reckoning. You define your location, submerge, and plot a course. The log works and counts the miles. It all worked out pretty well.
If a submarine is surfaced and in what's called the deck awash position, when she's submerged to her top deck, and only the light railing of the conning tower is visible above the water, by the way, here it is, made of thin metal. The submarine can be controlled from here. It's noteworthy that, unlike other ship types, where the main control device is the usual and well-known wheel, a submarine is steered by this hand grip, which can be tilted left and right. And when the order to crash dive is given, all crew members posted here jump down this hatch very quickly and seal it.
My friend Yura Mogilnikov used to say, once you've sealed the hatch, you're already at war.
A signal from the air radar. Emergency dive. Leaving. For half an hour you carefully maneuver, then start checking the surface. You start charging, but something else happens. It's the air radar again, and you dive at once.
Having crossed all the anti-submarine screens undiscovered, on October the 14th, the submarines of the Northern Fleet arrived at their designated positions in the Sargasso Sea, east of the Bahamas. The grandiose Operation Anadir, which was aimed at deploying strategic nuclear missiles and associated personnel in Cuba, had reached its decisive stage. The events that started in mid-October 1962 in the Caribbean entered history as the Cuban Missile Crisis. From October 14, when an American reconnaissance plane had discovered Soviet ballistic missiles on Cuba, the ideological confrontation of two superpowers grew more and more intense each day, threatening to escalate into open military conflict. The United States mobilized its armed forces and prepared a landing operation on Cuba. Soviet submarines were on hand to prevent this from happening and hold the US fleet at bay. Almost the entire US Atlantic Fleet was dispatched to search for the Soviet submarines. Washington didn't know their exact type and how many of them had arrived at Cuba. The Soviet submariners hunkered down in the deep without the slightest idea that they were in the middle of such an explosive situation. Daily radio contact with Moscow didn't provide any answers to the questions that were perplexing the sailors. The air was filled with messages that only increased the anxiety and tension.
The general staff that gave us orders didn't provide us any information, even when aircraft carriers were on approach and more than 20 destroyers were searching for us, with each carrier having its escort destroyers. Aviation was in the air almost all the time, and we still didn't get any data on the situation.
If you've been detected and the enemy is following you, there are such devices to deploy, such as the GIP-1 and MG-34. They were shot out from what's known as the VIPs. It's a sort of small torpedo tube in the 7th compartment. So those devices were launched outside and created active interference, hydrogen bubbles and whatnot. So you could shroud yourself in this bubble cloud, thus rendering the sonar operator on a surface ship unable to hear you. Then you can leave the area and maneuver freely.
On October 27, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Its pilot died. At the same time, intelligence from the US anti-submarine forces indicated the presence of no less than 29 submarines in the Sargasso Sea. 6 of them were confirmed. The US Navy was ordered to find the Soviet submarines and force them to surface at all costs.
We found ourselves pinned down. We understood that we needed to try something. We laid low, switched to endurance speed, with only emergency lights on and the sonar active. Everything else was switched off. Hydrogen concentration was at the limit. The battery was about to explode. Oxygen was very low. We had virtually nothing to breathe. Carbon dioxide was off the scale. We did the only thing we could. We put carbon dioxide burners in the central command post so that at least those inside could keep their heads clear.
According to battle stations, not less than 10 people were in the central command post, a number that corresponded to the number of battle units and main submarine systems. People stood here literally back to back. The navigator and captain worked here. The bow and aft horizontal rudders were also controlled from here. And this is the workstation of the diving and servicing systems operator. Submariners say that working here is like playing the piano. It's not enough to know the function of every valve, you also need to open them with the correct timing and in the correct sequence.
A submarine is a high-risk object. Two elements, water and fire, and the lives of 80 people between them. What's scarier, fire or water? I haven't decided yet. They're both scary. Moreover, there's no escape in such a confined space, so everyone is on edge.
When a submarine is on combat alert, all compartments are sealed tight. So in case of an emergency, people locked in a compartment have no one to count on but themselves. Each room had the necessary set of tools to fight fire or flooding. Control systems for movement and air and energy supply systems were duplicated. 3 evacuation routes were provided, through the central command post, through the torpedo tubes in the 1st and 7th compartments, and through a special hatch in the 7th compartment, equipped with a pad for docking rescue apparatus. The crew could also evacuate through it independently, using survival suits. However, all these systems become useless when the crew are exhausted by heat and nervous tension, and are on the edge of fainting because of air shortage.
That's why the situation in the sub was dreadful. When we understood that we only had enough air left to blow the ballast, basically to surface once, Captain Dubivka decided that we should surface. We had no idea what was waiting for us there. Not a slightest idea.
In the early morning of October 31, 1962, after 34 hours of playing cat and mouse, B-36 surfaced near destroyer USS Charles P. Cecil. The ship trained her guns at the Soviet submarine's conning tower, but never fired. It meant that the war hadn't started, but the game between the Soviet submarines and US Navy didn't end there. 2 days later, B-36 managed to sneak away from the US destroyer, which was a mere 100 meters away from the sub.
Our flag and periscopes were up. We didn't lower them. They were drying up in the sun. We didn't lower anything before diving to avoid giving our opponent any warning. Then we dropped down to 25 meters and slipped under them. They sounded the siren and started searching for us, but by then we had already left.
The crew of the Soviet submarine didn't know that the missile crisis had been successfully resolved just 2 days prior. During the Cuban crisis, the US Navy discovered and forced 3 Soviet submarines to surface, but they didn't know then, and even for the 30 years that followed, how many more of them had been deployed near Cuba.
As it turned out, It was maybe the most reliable and convenient project required by the Soviet Navy at that time. I completed 3 tours of duty on a submarine of this project. I waited my meeting with the submarine like I probably waited for my first love. I remember it like it was yesterday. They wanted to send me to Kronstadt, to a repair base, but I resisted for as long as I could. And because I got there the first, I got lucky. My friend was assigned to a base at Kronstadt for 2 years, and so I was brought to my submarine and the first mate presented me. They were cleaning the boat up that day and playing some music. That's how I became a submariner.
Foxtrot-class submarines were built between 1958 and 1979. In total, 75 ships were constructed. 17 of them were delivered to India, Libya and Cuba. The B-413 submarine was launched in October 1968. During her first long cruise in the summer of 1969, the boat was part of a ship squadron that arrived at Cuba on an official visit. It's noteworthy that during that voyage, the submarine was able to find her way into the Gulf of Mexico, a US Navy training area, which provoked a stormy reaction in the American media. It's possible that this act was to remind the US Navy about recent events. From September 12, 1973 through October 8, 1974, B-413 undertook the longest voyage of her career, 392 days at sea with the same crew. That cruise occurred in the Mediterranean during the Arab-Israeli conflict, known as the October War, and the submarine was in the area of hostilities. At the end of June 1990, B-413 passed through the White Sea, Baltic Canal, and joined the Baltic Fleet. In 1999, after 31 years of service, submarine B-413 was decommissioned from the Navy and transferred to the museum. It's noteworthy that the submarine sailed from Kronstadt, her final base, to Kaliningrad, where we are now, under her own steam while surfaced. And now, the ship whose purpose was to remain hidden is now on display for everyone to see.